The only time I've had a legitimate table saw kickback occur is when I was about 19, 20 years old. Now I turned 40 in May, so it's been quite some time. I was using an old Delta Unisaw cabinet saw, and I was trying to cut some 1.5-inch blocks out of some hardwood to do a checkerboard style glue up. Now I was young, I had no training on the saw, but I was super pumped because I had all these great tools and lumber around me, and I was ambitious. So I took, let's say this square is a little longer and I needed to square it up. So I ran it through the blade this way. Now some of you are probably cringing as you watch this because you know the end result already. I don't know 100% that I had a splitter. I'm pretty sure I was using a push stick. I sure the heck hope so. If I did, it was one of these type. This was primarily all that was around back then. As I pushed it through the blade, it caught and it flung back out at me. And when it did, it hit me square in the chest, and my Carhartt vest that I was wearing had an imprint of this square on the chest. So I put everything down, I walked away, but I don't think I really realized that it was a user problem. I think I probably said, oh, we need to dial in that machine, it's not cutting right or something, because that's kind of the mentality that we get into. Fast forward a couple weeks later, and a good friend of mine using the exact same saw, using a wobble dado and a pair of gloves, got his hand sucked into the saw blade, and he lost part of his ring finger and he lost part of his pinky finger, if I remember right, and he's obviously never been the same. It was at that point that I decided table saw safety is going to be way high up on my list of stuff that I need to learn. So I did as much research as I could. I asked a lot of people that have been working in wood shops longer than I had, and I really made this a real key point in my knowledge of the tools in the shop and that kind of space. Now, I say I haven't had a table saw accident since then. However, that could change tomorrow. It could change the very next time I turn this saw on. So just because you have a lot of experience with the saw and you've been doing it the one way your whole life and you're never going to change, that's fine. It doesn't mean it can't happen. So I'm going to go over a few of the things, the way I work in my shop, a few of the do's and the don'ts, the way I like to handle the material and set myself up to make sure that I'm going to have a successful day and make sure that it's my decision when I stop being able to use a saw and not the saws. What's going on, guys? I'm Jody. This is Inspire Woodcraft, and of course today we're talking about table saw safety and how it applies to my shop and the way I go about doing things. Now, over the last couple videos, actually since the push stick video, we've had a little bit of backlash from a few people in the comment section. And while a lot of this stuff that involves table saw safety is entirely controversial, meaning some people say you have to do it this way or you're doing it wrong if you do it this way or so on and so forth. We're all entitled to our opinions. Some people consider their opinions to be absolute fact and you cannot have a conversation with them and they kind of get aggressive with it. And I'm just gonna go ahead and put this out there. I know it won't do any good, but if we could just try and leave the comment section open for discussion and discussion only, and not vulgar and not name calling and not harassing, that would be amazing, because we haven't had that in the comment sections of a couple videos prior, and it's a little disappointing that it comes down to that. I don't think there's any room for that on these types of channels. That being said, let's jump into a day with me at the saw and what I go through. Now, of course, I can't cover every single aspect of every single situation, but I'm gonna try and do my best. So this video may last quite a while. I'm also getting over a cold, so forgive me if there's a little sniffling or coughing or heavy breathing once in a while. So there's a whole list of table saw safety stuff that we could talk about, and it's almost impossible for me to cover every single aspect of every single scenario that could possibly happen. But there's one thing that is absolutely true, and that is we need to protect ourselves before we ever get to the machine. So as much as we don't want to hear it, eyeglasses or a face shield, ear protection of some sort, proper footwear, a clean work area so that we're not slipping on any debris or offcuts that might be on the floor. That's all a very good way to start your day with a table saw. You're also going to want to make sure that the saw is unplugged if you're going to be working on the machine. I know this is stuff we've all heard before, but I need to throw this in here. Now, another thing for me in my shop, because I do have a little one that likes to wander in and push buttons once in a while, is I will try my hardest to lower the blade after I'm done if I'm not going to be coming right back to the saw. And that way there can't be anything set up here and then a saw gets turned on and it vibrates to the blade and kicks off or something. The other thing is that a lot of saws will come with some sort of a key for the power switch, and that's a safety lockout device. When that key is pulled, the switch is absolutely dead. It can't be turned on or off with the machine plugged in at all. So you know, there's obviously ways that you can make the saw a little bit safer when you're working around it and when you're not working around it, but you want to leave it plugged in. I think another point to bring up that I don't see talked about too often is actually user fatigue. And fatigue, I believe, can come in two different variations. You have fatigue as in, I didn't get enough sleep last night, I had a long week, I've been working really hard and not sleeping enough, and I'm just physically tired, whatever it might be that makes you feel tired. That's definitely fatigue. But another part of it that doesn't get mentioned too much is actually what I call production fatigue. And that would be where I'm making a bunch of repetitive cuts. It could be that I come in the morning and I'm wide awake and I'm ready to rock and roll. But as I start making my cuts, it becomes repetitive. And that oftentimes leads me to daydreaming about something else in a project down the road, or it gets me to thinking about, you know, well, what time is it, or I look up at my phone or something, some sort of distraction. You really don't want to have any distractions when you're working at the table saw. So I try to be hyper aware of that production fatigue, and I will shut things down, I will walk away, I'll start a new project, I'll take a break, I'll go get a drink of water or something, just to kind of reset my body and my mind and get my eyeballs on something else for a minute while I do that. And that goes for most everything else in the shop as well. Another thing that I'd like to bring up is how you actually present yourself at the table saw. Now, we talked about having glasses and ear protection, but there's a little more than that. Of course, loose clothing. A loose sleeve like this can get hooked on a piece of material as it's going into the saw, and it can also bump a piece of material, bumping it into a saw blade that's running while, you know, you're adjusting something over here. Same with the tail of your shirt. It can get caught underneath a board as it's traveling through, and if you deal with rough lumber a lot, you can also snag that rough lumber on a pocket or the fibers of your shirt and cause it to turn and twist and do all kinds of stuff. So it's kind of nice to have kind of a tidy presentation when you come up here. Hooded sweatshirts, I like to wear hooded sweatshirts. A lot of times I'll take the string, the cord out of it, or I'll tuck it inside my shirt here so that when I'm over the saw blade somehow, it's not going to get sucked down in there. The same is going to go for like long jewelry. I don't wear long jewelry. I'm fine with a ring and a watch and that kind of thing. I'm not going to have a dangly bracelet or something. I'm not going to have, if I wore earrings or something, I wouldn't wear something that was going to fall down into the saw. Obviously, I don't wear earrings, so I don't really know what else to say about that. But anything that's a potential hazard to either fall into your workspace or fall into the blade or disrupt what you're trying to accomplish it's just not a good idea. Now, the last part about coming up to the saw that I'd like to touch on is actually how we're going to move our bodies when we use the saw. Now, I read an article online the other day, and the list of stuff they had for table saw safety was really good stuff. The problem is the picture that they had for their list was of a guy using the saw, and he sort of had his weight down on the saw as he was pushing stuff through. Huge no-no. I don't recommend that at all. When I use the table saw, I like to stand firm on my feet so that my upper body can move independently, so that I can rock back and forth if I need to, but I'm never pushing down with my body weight on the saw. Remember, the saw is going to do the work for us, so there's no reason to get aggressive and really shove stuff through there. There's also no reason to put your weight on there, because in the event that something does move, if this fence that I'm leaning on right now just happened to pull out from underneath me, my hand would just go straight down. Now, if I'm here, I can go like this, and it looks like I'm putting all my weight on, but I'm not, because my hand is actually being supported by my arm and not by what's underneath me. So if you're using, you know, a push stick, if you're running it through by hand, no matter what you're doing, you always want to make sure you're standing firm and you're using your body parts independently and making sure that you're actually getting in line with that saw. Now, as far as where to stand at the saw, that's open for interpretation, because a lot of these topics that we discuss when it involves table saws, they become a little bit heated and people really lock into one school of thought. Now, some people say you should stand over here and do things this way. The right-handed people will say, well, that doesn't make sense because then I have to use my left hand and that's awkward. I totally agree with that. I happen to be left-handed. Some people say you should stand way over here. Some people say you could stand in the middle. Most people don't say exactly in the middle. I'm not really too concerned about it. I will tell you the way I do it, which is typically right about here. I turn with my hips sort of facing the machine like this, and I will actually come through this way. So I'm not exactly behind it, but I'm not exactly way off to the side of it either. And I will do that my whole way through the cut until I'm all the way through the cut. Now, because I'm standing here, I'm not directly in the path if a piece was to get ejected. Now, that's different than kickback. I'll explain in a second. But if a piece was to actually experience ejection, that piece would shoot off back here, hopefully missing my hip and going back towards me like that. Now, kickback's going to happen where the thing flips up and comes back around. I don't know how many people are successful in avoiding getting hit by a kickback when it happens, so I don't really know that there's a perfect place to stand. Again, it's open for debate. This is just where I'm comfortable. I think that this provides me with a nice straight path. So when we talk about the setup of the saw itself, there's three critical components to a saw. There's the spinning blade, there's the tabletop, there's the fence. By bare minimum, you want the blade and the fence to be absolutely parallel. I have a reason for saying that before you jump into the comment section. I say by bare minimum because if you were only using this saw to make rip cuts, if your fence and your blade are parallel to each other, this table could be put on completely sideways and you would have no problem making cuts all day long. The reason is because in a rip cut, these are the only two things that are really utilized. In a cross cut, however, that's when we want the rail and the blade and the fence to all be on that same parallel line. Because remember, with a cross cut, we're going to be cutting it this way, and if this is not parallel to the blade, we're not even going to get 90-degree cuts to begin with. Now, as far as the safety equipment installed on the saw itself at the blade, there's a few different options. This is really going to open the doors up for some people to chime in on, so I apologize in advance. But what we have on my saw is I usually have what's called a riving knife installed on it. Now, there's a few different types of designs of riving knives, and there's another thing called a splitter. A splitter is typically on older saws who were never set up to use a riving knife. So a riving knife installs down into the housing, and in this one it has a quick release, and it goes up and down with the saw. So no matter where the riving knife and the saw blade are, they move in unison up and down. A riving knife isn't going to do that necessarily. From the ones that I've seen or been around, they usually will be embedded in here like a wedge into the insert, or they'll actually be bolted down in there. And there's some quick release options and whatnot. For me, the riving knife works just great, and I will explain farther here in just a second. The other way is going to be an overhead guard. Now, most shops that look like mine are not going to have an overhead guard on them because most of us take them off and then they just never end up going back on. And it's all personal preference. I do believe the guard can keep you safer. There's some people who say it actually makes it unsafe. I don't know that I agree with that, but I also don't know that I have the experience because most of my life I've used a table saw without an overhead guard on it. The overhead guard is going to have a splitter that comes off of it, and it's going to have a plastic piece that comes over the top, similar to a miter saw. And when you push the wood underneath that guard, the plastic part is going to come up, and it's going to allow you to still make a through cut, only a through cut, where you're actually taking one piece of material and trying to separate them into two. Now, the older saws, they would mount to the back. I think some of the newer saws, probably this one, mounts to the top. The problem with the older style that I always found was that because they were installed in the back, when I would move this piece of lumber through, there was so much room between the blade and the actual splitter that the wood could actually close back up just a little bit. And by the time I got to the riving knife, it would catch on that riving knife and have a problem. I have a hunch that's why a lot of people that run old saws say that the guard is actually worse and less safe than having it on there to begin with. Now, for a through cut, it's no big deal to have that on here because that board's going to slide right between there. If you are making a non-through cut, like a dado or a rabbit, then if this is in here, obviously you can't get the board through at all because your blade isn't splitting the wood completely in half, and that's when that would come off. Now, here's the beauty of a riving knife. Because a riving knife can be adjusted, I put this all the way down in there and I lock it down, the blade is actually sitting just a hair higher than the riving knife, which means that the cut is actually happening above the top of the riving knife. So if I make a non-through cut, like a dado, I can actually leave the riving knife on there and the board can pass through here without the need to take this off, which is really nice because then I don't have to remember to put it back on when I'm done. Now this saw has seen quite a bit of use and abuse over the last few years, and I'm searching now for a new saw. And I'll be absolutely honest, with the new saw, I really would like to start fresh with that saw, install the guard on it, and any other kind of safety equipment that I can. And I'd really actually like to start bringing back the use of using the guard on the table saw, because like most videos you see in most woodworkers shops you see, the guard and assembly is never on there. With the guard assembly on there, you're not going to be able to get your hands in there next to the blade if something was to happen. And I believe there's some fence tricks and stuff you can do when you're making narrow cuts that you could still leave the guard on there. So I'm going to look into that when I do get a new saw down the road. Alright, so with all that being said, I'm set up, I'm ready to make a cut, but what we haven't talked about yet is what exactly does this riving knife do? What is kickback? What is an ejection? How do those things happen, and how do we keep them from happening to us when we're operating the saw? So for that, let's take a closer look in here and see what's really going on. Now, in essence, a kickback typically occurs when there's a pinch point, and I think a really good way of understanding what the riving knife does, we've all seen featherboards. Featherboards are either store-bought or shop-built. They sort of sit in an angle like this, and they have a bunch of teeth that come out here. And the idea is that they sit back here behind the blade, and they provide a pressure to this so that it goes one way and holds it tight up against the fence, but doesn't allow it to move or come back out the other way. Now, I don't happen to have a featherboard, or else I would show you guys, so I apologize for that. Now, if you think of the riving knife in a similar fashion, the riving knife goes back there. If the featherboard keeps the wood from coming off at this end, the riving knife sort of keeps it from coming off at this end. And that's where your kickbacks typically occur, is a pinch point between the blade and the fence. Essentially what's happening is, as we come through here, there's downward force from the teeth of the blade going back down into the table saw housing. So there's not a lot of room for error. As we get past that and we come to the back of the saw blade, if this piece was to turn at all, this tooth is going to catch, and that's when you're going to have issues. Now remember, this piece is typically wedged in between here, right? So we want this piece to be able to just pass through. This is how wide we want it to go. So if there's nothing to prevent this piece from turning back in and it catches, it has nowhere to go but to bind and get tossed up and thrown back out at us, creating a kickback. Now, going back to my example with the 1.5" square pieces, a kickback can also occur from the metal of the blade itself. It's not always the teeth, although I would think that it's most likely usually the teeth. In my particular case, I had the piece in here, and of course my blade was lowered quite a bit more. However, when I had the kickback, it never had a chance to get to this point. It was stuck here. And because there was just the slightest little twist in there, it flexed that blade and was able to catch it and pop it back out right at me, which is why it hit me square in the chest right behind the blade. Now real quick, I want to talk about ejection before I forget. Earlier we said that we need our blade and our fence by bare minimum to be parallel. If it is not, let's say that your fence is skewed this way, and obviously this is for dramatic reasons. As you feed your stock through here, what's going to happen is it's going to cut here, it's going to keep cutting, it's going to keep cutting, but you're going to end up with a real jagged cut. It's not going to be a good cut. It's probably not going to be a straight cut because it's going to be harder to keep this pushed up against the fence. However, if you were skewed this way, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a pinch point. And at that pinch point, you're only going to be able to go so far before the blade gives in and says no, and it's going to shoot it back out this way. That's an ejection. An ejection can also be caused from a lack of downward pressure on here because the blade wants to force that material back out. Remember, the blade's spinning this way and we're pushing material into it, and there's opposite forces happening. Now if we take a look at this, let's say for instructional purposes that this is one board. Now as I run it through the saw, we're going to create a split. If that riving knife or splitter wasn't there, what would happen is the natural tension in that wood would close back up. And if it closes back up, it's going to pinch the back of that blade if this isn't installed. When it pinches that blade, it's going to cause friction, it's going to cause problems. Your saw is going to whine and moan. You're going to be able to hear it. If that was the case, for me, I would shut the saw off, I would lift it back up and out, and I would reevaluate the situation. But that is one way that you can get an ejection that can actually pass up over the saw and back out. I don't know that that necessarily causes a kickback. It will jump, but that's still more of an ejection than an actual kickback. Now, blade height has a lot to do with this as well. I like to go about a tooth or so height above the exit part of the cut, if that makes sense. So right about there. Another way that we can induce kickback is by, you see I have this goofy edge right here. This edge is straight. So if I run my board through, I can put pressure here against the fence and through, and nothing's going to happen. However, if I flip this around, I'm good through here, but when I get to here and I go to push that board through, you see that gap that automatically starts to happen? That's what's going to cause us to have a kickback. Because as I'm pushing through, when I put this in and it starts to close up against the fence, it has to go this way. Without a riving knife there, this thing would shoot back out. And even with a riving knife, on a cut this bad, you would have to be very careful, and you'd have to come at it from this side and push it all the way through, keeping this flat edge against the fence. But in traditional standards, as I push this through, it allows a chance for this board to exit to the left and cause it to jump over here and provide a kickback. So we always want to make sure that we have one straight line for reference. Now, if you guys saw the double side tape video, you know that I will often take double side tape on a known straight reference point, and I will double side tape that to this edge, and now this becomes one board. And as I pass this through here, I'm able to replicate this over here, making this now a nice straight path. Then if I needed to square the whole thing up, I could then flip the board over and run it back through, and I have a nice straight reference point to go off of. Now, another real quick way to induce a kickback is if you actually are doing a crosscut. And a crosscut, really by definition, is any time that your workpiece is wider along the cut path than it is long. So a piece, in my opinion, square or any longer is a no-no. For that, I'm going to get a miter box, or I'm going to get a miter gauge or something. I'm never going to run the piece through like this. And the reason is because at this point, for a dramatic effect, this is way easier to rock. That rocking into the blade is what's going to get that kickback. This is a lot harder to rock because it has a solid surface, and the long part of the cut is against the fence. So while we're talking about that, what's a safe distance from the blade? Well, again, that's up for a lot of discussion. I've seen a lot of articles written that say between 4 and 6 inches. Again, I think it's what you're comfortable with. Just keep in mind that the closer you are to the blade, when things go down, you might not fare too well. In a situation like this, I would probably make this cut just like this, and I would feel safe on doing so. Now remember, because of how I position my body, I know that I'm not putting my weight on this piece. I know that if this piece disappears from me, my hand doesn't go with it, because my hand is merely guiding the piece, right? And when I'm closer like this, this is 5 inches. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use this fence to help guide my fingers through. So a lot of times on this fence, because it's smaller, I'll kind of put a finger here and a finger on the outside, and I'll use that to feel as I go. And that'll actually keep my hand more locked to this than it locks to this. And as I'm pushing this through, if something happens and this flies away, it's not a guarantee, but it's good insurance to make sure that my hand's not going to go with it. Now, if the rule is that we're supposed to stay 4 to 6 inches away from the blade, how are we supposed to make narrower cuts without getting our fingers near the blade? And that's where a push stick comes in. And there's many different kinds, as you can see. This is my design that I came up with a while back. This is a more traditional style. I just mocked this up because I don't actually have one. I just made this today. This is John Heiss's model that he had come up with. And this is a gripper made by Microjig. This is a really wonderful unit here. There's a lot of different types. There's a lot of different kinds that are out on the market. But basically, a push stick is designed to be an extension of your hand in one form or another. So with this design, this does allow you to keep your fingers and your hands back away from where the blade is at, and you actually can clear the cut in most instances with your hand still being far away from the blade. And that's, I think, why people are so attached to this design. Other designs include, like I say, this is John's. There's a hook on the back, and that hook goes right onto the back of your material, and you actually apply downward pressure. That's why this is longer at the same time. I like to use these type all the way up against the fence. I like that I can feel the fence, so I know if I'm getting off course at all, and that pushes it through this way. Of course, my design that we came up with a little while back incorporates the same thing, only it has, you know, you can use it this way or you can use it this way. And with this one, I like the fact that with the sandpaper on there, I can really grip it and move it where I need it to go, which means that if I'm putting pressure on here, I can really suck it up tight against the fence and push it through, and I'm not going to have any issues. Another reason I like that is because as I pass over the blade, I know people say you shouldn't pass over the blade. I'm comfortable doing it. I've never seen anyone hurt from going over the blade myself, so I'm going to keep doing it. I can actually scoot this material away. That little waste piece that comes out of here, as I push this out of the way, I can nudge that waste piece out of there, and I can bring this piece back if I need to keep ripping it down smaller and smaller. So I do kind of like this design. There's also the gripper made by Microjig, and this probably needs to be lubed up, but this is adjustable. As you can see, this one's almost falling apart. I've used it so much. And for thin rips, I absolutely love this thing. So this is meant to go for the blade to pass through these channels right here. So you'd actually be going like this. And this works great because it's so grippy. And so I can put this right here, and as I cut through here, the blade's actually going into that channel, and it's not coming anywhere in contact with my arm, with my hand, or anything else, and it grips both pieces and sends it through to the other side off the edge or onto an outfeed table, which is what I wish I had. So this works exceptionally well. Now, the reason I don't care for the fish mouth design is because this you have to push closer to the blade. Because if you think about the way this force is working, you're pushing here and this is pushing against you. So with this, you really have to push closer to this side to keep that corner against the fence. The problem is it doesn't hold this corner against the fence. And again, I don't use feather boards because I don't have any. And so with this design, as I'm going through here, the tail could still wander around unnecessarily, even if I'm pushing the front actually into here. Now, you definitely wouldn't want to use it on this side, as this would actually push this corner closer to the left side of the saw, which of course would induce kickback. And again, I don't have the riving knife on just for display purposes, but you can see as it goes, once it clears, it starts to push out and get away from the edge of. The other thing I don't really like about these is because I have to push on this corner to keep that corner against the fence, they slip. And so I feel like I'm trying to control the stick more than I'm trying to control the wood, and I'd darn near rather have my hands in here than the stick at that point, because I trust my hands more than I trust the dang stick. So there's a reason why I don't care for this type, and that's really what it comes down to. Now we have the other types like John's here, perfectly good design. This one actually works great out here as well. Again, I would put something sticky on here just to up it a little bit more like we did with mine. These kind, I like them to be a little closer to the fence, if not actually at the fence. You're able actually to twist your hand a little bit and actually keep that thing down and in. I like the downward pressure of these types. I like the fact that as I'm applying a little pressure here, the top of the foot is, or the front of the foot is actually pushing down on the material, keeping it down where I want it, which kind of helps keep it sucked up to the fence. Same thing, only with this one we have grip. So again, I can clear the cut and I can bring it clear back around and reset if I need to. I don't have to wait for the machine to turn off before I reach over the blade. And so for this kind, same thing. It's not good to have it at an angle. I like to have it here, tied up against the fence as a reference mark, and then I can go. And by doing that, I'm actually using the fence in conjunction with the push stick to push up against the fence and keep everything as tight up against here as possible. So a lot of times on shorter stock, I will push it up against the fence, and I will push my push stick up against the fence, and I'll push it through. The gripper does even better at that, because as I'm pushing this through, the push block itself goes right up against here, and I can push the material and then the push block up against here, ensuring a nice clean cut. These things work really well, and I recommend them to everybody. My only issue with this is that I don't like it for an everyday push stick. I don't have it anywhere near me. It's sitting over there, and I kind of like some of the shop-made ones just because they're really handy to have right around you at all times. For thin rips, absolutely love this thing. We have, I believe this is a 1/4 inch leg that's on here, but I believe I have an 1/8 inch leg as well that we can put on here and get some really thin cuts right up next to the blade. So if we're not supposed to make a cut that's wider than it is long as it passes through the saw, essentially a cross cut, then how are we supposed to cut these pieces? Well, that's where a miter gauge or a miter box or a miter sled or something is going to come into play. Now with this, I can put an auxiliary fence on here if I would like. I can change the angle of this cut if I would like, and I'm able to pass this through no problem. When I cut this piece is going to fall to the side. I can then scoot the board back down, make another cut, or whatever it is I need to do. However, where you're going to run into problems is if you have the fence and you're using the miter gauge at the same time. You should never use the two of these at the same time. Reason being is as soon as you get to here and you start to make it through that cut, this is going to pinch and bind. It's going to kick back at you probably every time. So how do we make repeatable cuts? Well, there's some people that will put a stop block in here. Now this stop block allows for this piece to come clear when it enters the blade. It clears this block, and by doing so, when it's cut, this piece falls away and it's allowed to float inside of here, not being trapped between the fence and the blade. However, I'm not a big fan of that one either, and for me, what I do, and I think I showed you guys this in the double-side tape video, is I will actually set my fence to where I want it. Let's say that we want it at 3.5 inches. I will take a square cut piece of wood, I'll hold it there, and I'll completely get this thing out of my way. I'll use double-side tape on here. I'll tape it down to this. Obviously in this case I'm right above the rail, so I need tape on both sides. I'd tape it down, and now that's going to be stuck there. Now the reason I like this way better is because as I go through here, when this cut clears, it falls away from the blade, but it has all this room over here. So let's see I do this 3 or 4 times and the pieces are just kind of collecting over here. Well, now I can come in here and I can pick all these pieces up and move them out of the way, and they're not trapped in this narrow little area where now I'm forced to reach in, or I'm forced to turn off the saw and then do it, or some other way that might be a little unsafe. So for me, this stop block attached to the table itself works really well. I get this out of my way, and now I can keep going, and that cut is going to be the exact same measurement every time. And the other thing is I don't have to physically measure over, because with this I need to make sure that this measurement between the stop block and the blade is correct. With using a stop block on the table, I'm actually able to use my fence's measurements as my guide. So if I'm used to being able to set this at 8 inches and I know that that's 8 inches, well, now I still know that that's 8 inches. Now the problem with the factory miter gauges especially is they can be a bit sloppy in this miter slot and not be accurate. So a lot of people will switch to a miter sled, a crosscut sled, miter box I've heard it called before, and essentially this is not a full box. This is just a quick shop-made version. I have a piece of wood here that goes inside of this rail, which is set 90 degrees to this piece of plywood, and it has a fence along the back. Now with this, I measure over. This is where I want my cut. I set it up right there on this cut edge, and as I pass through here, it's going to slice this off, and this piece is going to fall down, and all is well. Another version would be something similar to this. This is my thoroughly beat up, originally made crosscut sled that I made, and it works the same way. You can see the blade is here, and this passes through. So same thing, I can put my material up against here, and as I push this through, it'll cut that material and leave it hanging off to the side. Now you can do repeated cuts with this as well. You could take a stop block, double side tape, or clamp it to this, and now you're able to pass through here. However, you're going to want to secure this piece as well, because if this piece is left caught in between here, this can cause a bind right here. A good trick is to use not a pen but an eraser from a pencil and hold this piece here as you run it through here. This is going to hold this securely down to this table, and when you pass through you can kick it out of the way, or if you're just doing a shallow cut you can hold it here, you can reach in and toss that piece to the side, but your stop block is going to allow you to make those repeated cuts over and over and over again. Now this crosscut sled was made intentionally long because I was doing long cutting boards and whatnot. Now when you make one of these, you want to be able to support the offcut and the material left over equally, because if you don't, what's going to happen is if there's a piece sticking way out here and there's a lot of weight out here, you're going to get partway through this cut, and when you get to about right here, it's actually going to bind up, and that's going to cause a problem, because as the saw blade goes through, this piece, the weight of this piece, say it was longer, is going to come up and bind on that saw. So both sides need to be supported as well as they can across the whole surface, just like the table on your saw is. One more point I wanted to bring up with using the miter gauge is, let's say I just wanted to cut this piece in half this way, which by the way, freehand, never a good idea. So I'm going to bring it through, I'm going to run it through the saw like this. If this piece is bowed at all, there can be a pinch point. So let's say that the bow actually goes in this direction. I don't know if that's showing up or not. If the bow is going in that direction, then what's going to happen is when I get to here, it's going to cut into here, and then at some point that piece is going to relax. When it relaxes, the two are going to come together, and that can cause a pinch point. So what you should do is at that point turn this around. With the bow going the opposite direction, when I cut this through here, when it relaxes, it's going to fall back into here and not into the direction of the blade. There's no pinch point. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap it up for this. I'm sure there's some stuff that I didn't touch on that I wished I would have. I'll know more when I go back and edit this video. This was really hard to do because I'm losing my voice as we speak, and I've been coughing after about every half sentence. So it's actually made it really hard to talk to begin with. Table saws are no joke. It's often said that table saws account for the majority of the injuries that happen in the wood shop, and I have not looked into that myself to see the statistics. I just take it for what it is. I think that at the end of the day, you need to do what you're most comfortable with. I've seen a lot of people do a lot of crazy stuff with a lot of crazy machines that I wouldn't do because I didn't feel comfortable doing it. It just didn't look right, it didn't feel right, it was too awkward, and that's when you need to back away from it. However, I don't think you need to be afraid of the table saw. I think you need to respect the table saw the same as you respect a miter saw, which can also have kickback. I've had a miter saw jump off of the table before because it had a kickback so hard on a piece that got wedged in there that I didn't see. Things happen. All the tools in the shop need to be respected. The table saw is definitely one that needs to be respected, but you don't need to be afraid of it. Table saw can do a lot for you in the shop, but you have to be smart and you have to be safe. Again, these are just the things that I do in my shop on a regular basis, and it's the way I do them. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it wrong either. Like I say, there's a lot of opinions. Some people will take their opinions to be fact, and that's okay for the most part, because I guarantee you if you came to my shop and told me I was doing everything wrong, I would get upset. And I'm not telling anyone that anyone is doing anything wrong. What I'm just trying to show is, especially for the people that are new to woodworking, here's how I operate, here's the things that I've become comfortable with as time has gone on, and maybe it'll help you. If you see something that I do and you're totally not okay with it and you just don't think that's for you, well, don't do it. Find a different way to do it, or find a different machine to do it with, and that's totally fine. So I think that's going to wrap it up. Like I say, please be safe when you're out there cutting on the table saw. Even the pros, mistakes happen all the time. Remember, an accident is something that can't be foreseen, and you can't change the direction and the path that you're going into said accident. An incident, totally different word, and we should use that word more often. Let's try and keep it clean in the comment section, please, because I know videos like this tend to lend themselves to some pretty vulgar comments, like I said earlier, so let's keep that to a minimum if we can, please, and thank you for watching this video. As always, and I'll see you guys in the next video.